Good evening. Excuse me. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Georgia's Road to Decriminalization. This is the next webinar in the Road to HINAC series. HINAC will be in Emory, Virginia in early June. So today we just want to talk to two people who were instrumental in getting the law in Georgia modernized. So first, let me introduce you to, you want to do the housekeeping first? Yeah, do the housekeeping first, Kevin.
Great. So I'm Kevin Lish with the Cero Project. Just a few housekeeping notes. If you have comments or questions, if you'd please use the chat, we'll monitor it. And we will be recording, we will put the recording on our YouTube channel as soon as possible after the webinar. And please stay on mute if you're not speaking.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so we have Jeff Graham and Jada Hicks, who were instrumental in getting the law in Georgia passed. So Jeff, rather than read your bio while you're sitting here, I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Malcolm. It's great to be here. I'm the executive director of Georgia Equality. We are an LGBTQ organization, statewide group here in Georgia, but we do a lot of health policy work, and then specifically a lot in the space of HIV and AIDS. And then personally, I started working on HIV issues when I was a college student in the mid-'80s, was very active in ACT UP in the early 90s. And then for about a decade, I ran a statewide HIV organization here in Georgia called AIDS Survival Project that was based on the model of peer support and peer leadership. So people living with HIV, leading and working and training other people living with HIV. Thanks, Malcolm.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. And next we have Ms. Jada Hicks. Jada, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Malcolm. Hi, everyone. My name is Jada Hicks. I use she, her pronouns. I am a staff attorney at the Center for HIV Law and Policy, where I head our Positive Justice Project, or PJP work. So we work with coalitions throughout the nation to reform HIV criminal laws and provide any sort of policy and educational support that we can provide to the coalitions. I'm so happy to be here today to talk about the road that Georgia had to take in order to reform their law. And I guess a little bit about me, I'm originally from North Carolina, and I guess I like to joke that I'm a reformed prosecutor. So really stumbled into policy work, took quite a turn from where I started. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jada. And you know what's funny about that is that earlier today, when I was, putting together and I asked you for your bio, I just went to LinkedIn to look, and I was like, oh, I didn't know Jada was a prosecutor. So thank you for being here. Next slide, Kevin. And so next is me. I'm Malcolm Reid. I am the Director of Programs for Thrive SS. I am also the co-chair of the Georgia HIV Justice Coalition. I came in on pretty much the tail end. A lot of the work had already been done when I started working with the Georgia HIV Justice Coalition, but I was really amazed at the work that was being done. I also am the chair of the Policy Action Committee for the USPL HIV Caucus. So while I'm not running programs for Thrive SS, I'm knee deep in policy, and it's one of the things that I really love to do. So I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. I thank you two for being here. And let's get started. Kevin, I think you had some other slides about future events, and then we'll get going, right?
Right. And so the first one is just to remind everybody that HIV is not a crime, as I think right at 100 days away, June 4th through the 7th, 2023 in Emory, Virginia. And the registration is open to register to come join us in Virginia. And then just to go through some upcoming events, the next webinar on April 10th is the What to Expect webinar. That is usually the webinar right before HINAC, so we're getting close, everybody. And this coming Tuesday, HIV is Not a Crime Awareness Day webinar is February 28th at 7 p.m. Eastern, and it's going to be moderated by everyone's model advocate, Tana Pradia. And then on March 10th, the Cero Project will be hosting a webinar taking people through the second HIV criminalization survey that we did after the first one. I believe it was 8 years ago, and to see how things have changed. And once the webinar starts, I will drop all those links into the chat. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Malcolm.
All right, fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you very much. All right, so let's get started. So Jeff, I'm gonna start with you. How did the Georgia HIV Justice Coalition get started? Did you start working on the criminalization bill before we started the coalition, or did the coalition start? How did all of that happen?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Malcolm. And yeah, actually the work on modernizing the criminalization bill started before the coalition. It actually started probably close to 10 years ago or so. We worked with Cero Project primarily, a group of HIV service providers and folks living with HIV and AIDS in the community wanted to have a town hall meeting. And we used to run a community center, so we hosted that at our facility. And frankly, I attended because this is an issue that is critically important to me. And after that presentation that night, folks asked if we could continue the conversation, what was going to happen here in Georgia. And that's kind of when I became more officially involved with that. Originally, Georgia Equality just wanted to play a supporting role in that. And quickly, the need for having some sort of ongoing mechanism developed. And it really was through the Prevention Justice Project from the Center for HIV Policy and Law. Actually just created a listserv and was running it before there was an official coalition. And we would meet regularly. I think we'll probably talk more about the process of how we got there. But over the course of the first few years, we certainly appreciated the Center for HIV Policy and Law providing a lot of leadership and direction. But it was felt that we really needed to have a more of a Georgia-based coalition on that. And then that's where the Georgia HIV Justice Coalition eventually formed. It went through a couple of iterations, a couple of different name changes, but then that over the last 5-year period really was the group of people that directed this work collectively.
Awesome. So when you started down this path 10 years ago, did you expect that it would take 10 years to get a law passed?
Well, actually, having worked in politics in Georgia down at the state capitol for almost 30 years now, I did think it was going to take a while to do. In fact, I was shocked at how once we actually had bipartisan support for a bill and an actual bill that we could all agree to, and it took about 7 years to just reach agreement on what the legislation was we wanted to introduce and how we were going to track that. Once we got to that point, it actually happened relatively quickly. And I think maybe we can talk a little bit about that later. Yeah. But I was not at all surprised that it was going to take a decade and or more. And I think that's something that is a lesson that people need to really know and understand, that this work in many places is going to take a while to accomplish.
That's awesome. So Jada, I see you shaking your head. When did you become involved? I know you're with, Jeff mentioned HIV law and policy. Were you there at the beginning?
So I was not there at the very beginning. CHLP started in 2015 working with advocates to really try and get a group off the ground. And like Jeff said, it just started off as a listserv and kind of grew into this coalition where we had monthly meetings and facilitation, and more of approaching it across from like a group perspective and lens. So I became involved with the coalition in 2018. And at that point, a lot of the groundwork had been done, and it really was more so about strategizing and how best to get a bill passed while incorporating, the group really tried to incorporate the PJP principles. When I'm done speaking, I'll put a copy in the chat, but it's basically, there needs to be an intent to transmit, coupled with conduct that is likely to transmit. We like to see actual transmission, removal of felony level enhancements if we can, HIV. It's not HIV specific. If we can get all of those things, it's kind of what we strive for as like the gold standard of a bill. And so I think for Georgia, it was really about how do we get the most out of the bill? Thank you. D from Center for HIV Law and Policy has popped in the PJP principles if anybody wants to take a look. And so just trying different strategies, different committees. At one point it was in the health committee, and then we moved to the judiciary committee. We tried an omnibus bill package, and then we went through iterations of trying to get it attached to different bills. And so I really think it was a group and consolidated effort in terms of what approach we wanted to take and what compromises we were willing to make as a coalition.
Awesome. So what is the process of becoming a member of the coalition? So if I'm an individual, I'm not with any organization, how do I become a member? And then if I am a member of an organization, how do I become a member? That would be, Jeff, I'll throw that to you.
Sure. So it is going to be open. This is the big disclaimer that we have to say right now. Because the bill was passed and signed into law last summer, and because Georgia Equality actually also works a lot on elections, we had a very intense election year that lasted all the way through. As folks probably from around the country will remember, we were still voting on who was going to be our U.S. Senator until the middle of December. So Malcolm, as the co-chair of that coalition, and then credit where credit is due, our Deputy Director, Eric Polk, worked with Malcolm and really did the coalition work. I'm kind of here just for window dressing today. And that's why I say it's important to know the credit where credit is due. Eric was doing a lot of that. I was doing some of the direct lobbying down at the Capitol on this bill, so I was involved every step of the way. Last fall, Eric did take a position with another company, and so the actual coalition meetings are currently on hiatus until we can hire some new staff at Georgia Equality. So that's a long way of saying once we restart, because there is still work that needs to be done in this space, and I anticipate that we will restart within the next couple of months. We're in the middle of our legislative session right now. Once we get new staff, probably by early summer, we will restart the coalition, and then it will be reaching out through the email that we will have associated with the staff person to do that. So I could tell people that they could approach Malcolm as the co-chair right now, but that's probably not fair to do to you. And I also want to level set expectations. I don't think we will have another meeting until midsummer, which is when we're going to start looking at what is the work that needs to take place going forward, both in terms of educating the community on the changes in the law, but then also what needs to come next in terms of policy and potential legislative action in the future.
Yeah, awesome. I did talk to Eric when we were at that meeting at City Hall, and we did talk about, getting things moving again. So yeah, summer sounds good because right now, it's heavy HIV conference season and everything else. So we've got a lot on our plates, and I know you're doing the Georgia AIDS Watch on Monday, as a matter of fact. So we'll be down at the Capitol lobbying for everything else around HIV.
Yeah.
some
Yeah,
very
and actually, since you give me that opportunity, there's a good chance that one of the things we're going to accomplish this year is we won't get a full Medicaid expansion, unfortunately, but I do believe that we are going to get authorization for the state Department of Community Health to do what's called an 1115 demonstration project that would expand Medicaid to about 13,000 people living with HIV, up to 138% of the federal poverty level that are currently denied eligibility to even apply for the Medicaid program. So that's the big thing that we're working on right now, and I hope that we will be successful with that.
Yeah, and that in itself is justice for people living with HIV, believe me. Thank you so much. So, and this is to both of you. So, you've given me some, a little bit of the road. So, Jeff, you said 10 years ago. So I'm just going to go back to 2013, 2014. So, what would the I know you mentioned that you got the listserv together. What other accomplishments were in those early days? Was there a consensus? What
to be honest with you, as someone who had been doing direct frontline HIV advocacy as my full-time job for a long time, the first thing we needed to do was make sure that the HIV community was united behind changing the law. And that happened actually quicker than I was worried it would be. And the reason that I point that out is that over the years, as I had done presentations to a number of groups, and I always talked about this law and how unfair and unjust it was, I would, more often than I wished happened, would have groups of people, including groups of people living with HIV, that would say, no, we actually think the law is a good thing because we want to be able to punish the person that we feel we contracted HIV from. And so that was the first hurdle, was making sure that not just all of the providers, but again, the PJP principles that are there, nothing about us without us, having the voices and involvement of people living with HIV and AIDS is incredibly important. It's a tenet of all of our advocacy. It was a tenet of all of the work on this issue that we have always done. And so there was just, it took a minute to make sure that everybody was comfortable with this approach. Then it took, we were able to actually get, then the next, frankly, point was, do we repeal or do we reform? And there was some vibrant conversation back and forth. Frankly, ultimately, we decided to go with reform, in large part from some of the advice that we had gotten from the Center for HIV Policy and Law, that at that point in time had seen where there were some states that had either completely repealed or that did not have an HIV criminalization statute at all. And you basically, my words here completely, you would have these rogue prosecutors that would just kind of invent the law. And so we made the decision that while we would love to have no law whatsoever, any law is stigmatizing. And so I'll just admit that right up front. This is kind of one of the compromises we made early on. Having a law that was narrow, having a law that set boundaries that prosecutors could not cross, we felt was ultimately in the best interest of the rights of people living with HIV, so that they if they were to be prosecuted at some point in the future, there would at least be some guardrails going forward, and it wouldn't just be these rogue prosecutions where people would show up one day in court and suddenly find out that they were facing attempted murder charges. So that is really what took a lot of our focus the first 2 or 3 years as a coalition, to just work through those issues and make sure everybody was in agreement with that. And there were a couple of times, because we really took seriously that if people in the coalition, if there were folks that were uncomfortable with this approach, we would stop and we would wait and we would talk and we would discuss until people could feel comfortable going forward.
Excellent, excellent. Jada, anything from you? You want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, so I think what's important about what Jeff is saying is that the general criminal law in Georgia has been used to prosecute people living with HIV. So we've seen them prosecuted for aggravated assault, for example, for things like biting or spitting, which we know is not going to transmit HIV. And so really what we were trying to do is cabin prosecutions. So, of course, it's never ideal to have a law where you can target people living with HIV, plain and simple. However, what we're really trying to do is take away some of the prosecutor's power. So when they prosecute under the general criminal code, any charge that they think fits the facts of the case, they can charge with. So aggravated assault, we've seen attempted murder, we've seen terroristic threats, we've seen all of that, all stemming from someone's HIV status. And so when we took this approach, it really was about how do we take the power away from the prosecutors and say, there is a specific law that is for or intended for the prosecution of individuals living with HIV in these very specific circumstances, when they have the intent to transmit, when it's coupled with with conduct that is substantially likely to transmit. We're really trying to put their backs against a wall kind of and say, here's when you can prosecute. And we're trying to give defense attorneys the tools that they need to say, the legislature intended that an individual living with HIV be prosecuted under this statute. And that is the appropriate statute and not to go under the general criminal code. And so I think that, was something that the coalition obviously struggled with. Honestly, every coalition I've ever been in has struggled with making that decision and what is best in their state, especially based on past conduct from the prosecutors and what type of charges they've seen being brought against people living with HIV. So it really is most of the time state specific in terms of what approach is going to be best. And so for the Georgia coalition, that was definitely something that we grappled with, I think, throughout the entire process, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I think the guardrails scenario is really, really important, because I remember those conversations about, repeal or modernization, right? We're either going to modernize the law, reform the law, or we're going to repeal the law. And then I remember specifically one night, and we were talking about, hey, if there is no law, then it's open season. And I remember, I think at that time, someone was being prosecuted in Texas for attempted murder, and another person was being prosecuted for, I think it was a terroristic threat one. I can't remember off the top of my head, but that made sense to me, because I know when I first, I think I was at HINAC in Indianapolis, and it was my first HINAC that I had ever been to. And I came away from there like, we're going to change this damn law. We're going to repeal these laws. It's terrible. We're going to fix this. And then common sense came into play and was like, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. We have a question in the chat box from Chad. It says, did you also include no new charges for other STBB? I think it's STBBI. I'm assuming he means sexually transmitted diseases. Chad, if you want to type anything else in there.
Here.
But the question is, did we also include any new charges for other STIs?
No, and I that was primarily because the decision was to reform the statute, and the statute itself was pretty specific around HIV. So that's again that and Jada had mentioned this earlier, and I think it's frankly important and can be instructive for other coalitions that are doing this work. We kind of broke it down to like 8 policy priorities that we could define in the bill. So intent to transmit HIV, an affirmative defense that transmission that you had to engage in an activity that was, I think the language we finally settled on was scientifically viable means of transmitting HIV. So for instance, U equals U. If someone can prove that they are undetectable, you cannot bring charges under the new law here in Georgia. The felony statute, we wanted to eliminate the felony statute. There were two felony statutes. One was around biting, spitting, throwing bodily fluids on police officers or correctional officers. That was eliminated. The felony was downgraded. We didn't get that. So by breaking it down into those, it became a little bit easier for us to track how well we were doing if we were not able to accomplish 100% of the legislation as we drafted it. And I do think it's important to know that we did actually draft it. The person who drafted it, the original language as it was introduced, is a former defense attorney. He's a former attorney with Lambda Legal, and he is someone living with HIV and AIDS. And so he was not just an expert on the field, he was someone personally impacted by the law that then did the rewrites based upon the PJP principles that we were taking into account to draft it.
Okay.
And I was just going to throw in that I think that's something that is difficult for a coalition to decide as well. Should this be HIV specific? Should we say communicable diseases instead? Because obviously it's very stigmatizing to have HIV singled out as the only communicable disease to be punished in this way. But I think for the Georgia coalition, it was all about, there are some things that we are going to keep based on other things that we're going to get from the bill. And so I put in the chat a before and after that we did for the reform efforts in Georgia that kind of gives a breakdown of here's what the law was before and here's what the bill changed. And I think it gives kind of a good understanding of what sort of compromises we had to make, but how many strides we also made in that same vein. And every coalition faces that. Unfortunately, we can't all be California and just get everything. It's very difficult to do. And so oftentimes the political realities are that some compromises are going to be made, especially given your state's legislative makeup. It can really affect that.
Yeah, compromise is politics. I mean, you don't get everything that you want all the time, especially in the South. Have another question from the participants. Was there organized opposition to the coalition's legislative goal?
No. We were very lucky that way. Frankly, and it's important to know that we actually the bill the first time it moved, and it actually ended up moving a couple different times. If we want to, we can kind of talk about kind of what happened behind the scenes to make this happen. But it came out of committee, and it was the bill as exactly as it had been drafted, as we had agreed upon. It was not until it got right before a vote in the House of Representatives, which is where it started, right before a floor vote, there was one representative who serves on the Rules Committee, and he took exception to the fact that this had been downgraded from a felony to a misdemeanor. And so, unfortunately, he was powerful enough that as a singular person, he said, you have two choices. You can keep it as a felony and we'll downgrade the felony, or you can see your bill die in the Rules Committee and never come to a floor vote. And so I think that this was one of the more difficult conversations we had as a coalition, because none of us were happy with that. But it was a political reality that we faced. And we actually had conversations about, well, going into an election year, what if the makeup of the legislature changes? I mean, those were all, really sophisticated, hard conversations that we were having. This is where I'm so proud of everybody in the coalition, that we were able to just trust each other, that we all had best intent. And so we were able to have these hard conversations. And that was the biggest compromise that we had to make there was to allow it to remain a felony, but keep it downgraded as a felony. But then there was no opposition to it. Once we got that legislator support, and then, spoiler alert, it ended up passing 3 times through the House of Representatives unanimously, and ended up passing twice through the Senate almost unanimously. And then we finally got lucky, and it ended up passing both chambers. So
yeah, exactly. And believe me, I remember that night. Like, oh my God. What do you mean it's still going to be a felony? That's what we've been fighting for. We can't have a felony, and then we, cooler heads prevailed. And yeah, I mean, we got that done. So in this process, who are our legislative champions? Who were the people that we could go to particularly on the Republican side? Because I know this ended up being an example of bipartisanship when you look at the final vote. But who on the Republican side were our champions?
Yeah. So first of all, and I do think it's worth saying, one of the things that we had kind of early on decided as a coalition, there had been some early bills that were introduced with just Democratic support. The political reality here in Georgia, there are not enough Democrats to pass a bill without Republican support. And so with very few exceptions, you have to have your lead sponsor as a Republican. We are lucky enough in Georgia that the chair of our House Health and Human Services Committee is she's a former nurse. She is actually incredibly knowledgeable about HIV, and she is a very strong ally. And so Representative Sharon Cooper, Chairperson Cooper, it was her throwing her weight behind this and shepherding it through, and the respect that she had and continues to have as part of the leadership of the Republicans in the House of Representatives, and then frankly, her willingness to prioritize this so that she would go to the mat against senators that if you don't pass my bill, I'm not going to pass your bill, kind of politics behind the scenes that kind of set the stage for that to happen. And I know that can be challenging and difficult in a lot of states, but was really part of the key. Working closely with her was State Representative Sam Park, who not only was the first openly gay man elected to the Georgia legislature, but he is now general counsel for Positive Impact Health Centers as his day job. And so he has a good working relationship with Chairwoman Cooper. And it was really kind of the two of them that kind of worked in tandem to navigate those political waters. The other thing that we were able to do that helped set the stage for this is long about the time that the Trump administration came out with the Ending the HIV Epidemic, Georgia started producing its state plans on this. We were able to convince Representative Cooper to hold a special committee on HIV issues. And that committee issued a report. And frankly, at the end of the day, the report was very general in its recommendations, but we were able to take those general recommendations and then add definition to what those recommendations should be. And so part of what we were able to take with this special committee report on the HIV epidemic in Georgia was turning one of the bullet points into a recommendation to reform our HIV criminal law. And then once we had that came out of this committee report, we were able to take that, add that to our state plan around ending the epidemic, add it to the county plans for ending the epidemic. So suddenly it started popping up in all of these official reports that were coming from the Republican administration, coming from the Republican legislature, that started calling for HIV criminalization reform. And that helped tremendously to kind of set that path that this was not a Democratic initiative. This was not an LGBT initiative. This really, we were able to basically define it as a Republican initiative and a Republican priority.
Wow, that's kind of sort of like what the president did at the State of the Union, made them stand up and say, we're not going to cut Social Security. I love Jedi mind tricks. We have another question in the chat. Was there any public education as the bill was introduced and making its way through the legislative process? And then I've got a follow-up to that too, so go ahead.
I think there was education all along the way. You know, I had to look back through some of my notes just to kind of refresh my mind on what happened in Georgia. And all along the way, you know, there were palm cards, fact sheets. There was the letter that we drafted to the House committee. There was outreach to representatives. There was webinars. So there was definitely different kinds of educational outreach. I think that's one of the most important tools in our toolbox, really, to try and get people on board with reform efforts. And I think one of the biggest struggles is educating legislators. And I think being responsive in the moment. So for instance, with the House committee, when we drafted a letter to talk about the bill and amendments that were being made, it's really an educational opportunity to point out, like, here is why this doesn't work. Let me give you a solution that would work and that still fits in and accomplish our goals along the way. So I think that was vital to the coalition's success, is that throughout the entire process are woven educational opportunities and events throughout the process.
And so what about education to the public, not just to legislatures?
Yeah, well, it included some of that. I guess I should preface, it depends on how you define public. So it was not, we didn't spend a lot of time talking outside of the HIV community, but we spent a lot of time talking within the HIV community. That said, I do think that one of the things that worked in our favor was that at one of our lobby days, where we were down and discussing this, there was a reporter that was there, spoke with one of the folks that was there at the lobby day. I asked him what was going on with the lobby day, and he told them about this HIV criminalization law. And it just happened to be a political reporter. It was a slow news day. And it was like catching lightning in a bottle. And so this political reporter was horrified to think that we had this law, and included it in some of his coverage of, Capitol Recap of the day was, this quote from one of the coalition members, a person living with HIV, talking about this horrible law. And so I think that also helped a little bit with just a little bit, just enough public education that there were folks that then started to go, that we have what now? And it was not a large part of what we did, but it was that piece in specific in the newspaper, I think, really kind of helped give us a little bit of a bump at a time that we needed it.
Excellent. So yeah, and so I remember, right before the governor signed the bill, we knew it had passed, and we knew it was going to be signed, and we were all itchy fingers on the keyboard, like, yeah, we're gonna get this. And I remember everybody saying, whoa, don't send anything out yet. Don't send anything out yet. Can you talk about what that trepidation was?
It was last year, and it was an election year. And I'm sure that folks have heard that it was not just the Senate race, but there was a very heated gubernatorial race here in Georgia. And we were just not sure what the governor was going to do. And, the governor had the option to sign, veto, or let pass into law without his signature. And so that in some ways was some of the worst. Waiting, I think it was about a 6-week period of time from the time that the law passed the legislature to the time that the governor signed it. And we just all had to just hold our breath out of concerns that if we celebrated too much too early, the governor might get some sort of political pressure to veto it. And
Exactly.
again, spoiler alert, it didn't happen. He signed it.
Right, right. Yeah, I remember we were feeling like nuns in Catholic schools with a ruler going and slapping people's hands. Don't touch that keyboard. Don't touch that keyboard. So
Stay off Twitter. Stay off Twitter.
Exactly. Exactly. So let's change direction a little bit. I want to talk about specific communities. We know that policing and criminalization in the Black community is really problematic. As we were talking through getting these laws changed, what considerations did we give to, you know, the Black community, minority communities, and you know, just people of color in general? And one of you can take that.
I think we really tried to center that in our movement. I think what was great about the Georgia Coalition as well, we actually had Black and brown people in the coalition, and that does not always happen. And you need people that represent these communities present for all of this work. And not only that, we have the Williams Institute report, and not every state has that. So the Williams Institute is a part, for those that don't know, I'm sure many of you do, of UCLA Law School. They basically research HIV-specific criminal laws and determine who is most affected and impacted by these laws within a certain state. And so we had the report from Georgia that showed exactly who was impacted, and it was what we already knew, that our Black and brown communities and our marginalized communities that already have harmful relationships with police and within the criminal legal system that are most affected by these laws. And so I think we really tried to center that with any sort of work that we did within the coalition. I think one of the things that was a huge sticking point for the coalition was when we knew it was either, you know, you take the felony and you take a reduction from 10 years to 5 years, or the bill dies, that it was a moment of, well, who is this affecting, right? We know that it's going to be affecting our Black and brown communities. How do we kind of reconcile that? It feels a little like a defeat in a sense, because we want to do everything that we can to protect our most marginalized populations. And I think for us, it was really about having, I really think efforts started in 2014, if I'm remembering correctly, all the way to 2022, and thinking, how can we get something in this political environment that accomplishes most of the goals that we want while still cabining prosecutions. And ultimately, that was what made us feel comfortable, was the fact that we were able to incorporate all of the other changes into the law as far as intent, coupled with, I believe it's like a scientifically viable means of transmission. Having that language is what made the coalition eventually comfortable with keeping this felony level punishment, also with the fact that it was going from 10 years to 5 years. But I really think we tried to center that through a racial justice lens. We really tried to center our coalition work in that way. And it's so amazing to me to have a coalition built of Black and brown advocates that are doing this work, because that is not something that you experience in most spaces. For instance, you know, in Ohio, shout out to Brian Jones, he's the only Black man in the coalition. And it is very hard to approach this work through a racial justice lens when you only have one Black person within the coalition. I think we were very lucky to have kind of a broad diversity within our coalition to also check everything that was happening and to give us input.
Yeah, exactly. And even in trying to include the sex work community, harm reduction, all of that. Any other words about those two communities? And also rural participation. Did we have anybody from any, and I know, Jeff, I know Georgia Equality does a lot of work out in the rural Georgia areas. But what I don't know is, and it's a shame to say that I don't know as co-chair, I didn't recognize that we had too many people from outside Metro Atlanta.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we did. There is a relatively active group of HIV advocates from the Savannah area. And I know that they worked on this. They would come up to Atlanta for a lobby day, sometimes, oftentimes in connection with us and our lobby day. Sometimes just the logistics did not work out and they would end up on a different day. But there was some from Savannah. So I do want to acknowledge that. But that's a big challenge for us here in Georgia is actually mobilizing folks in more rural communities to be actively involved with it. I think the other thing I just wanted to add, and Jada, you just said it so well about centering it in the realities of the people that are affected by this. The other thing, that conversation about to go forward with a reduced felony, that keeping it a felony or not, those of us kind of on the lobbying end of things, we were 100% ready to pull the plug on the bill. And it's just, you know, we were ready to do that. It was not a fake promise that we were going to center this in the people most affected. We were ready to pull the plug on it because we were not out to score a political win. We were out to do what people wanted us and needed us to do. And that was the only motivation for it.
Yeah.
Exactly. Go ahead, Jada.
I was just going to say, and to put it in perspective, you know, per the Williams Institute, 46% of arrests are Black men. So when I say that this data really was driving all of our efforts, I think we really paid attention to that. I know there was also a question about other communities. I don't recall having anyone that was a member of the sex worker community. However, that was something that was important to us as well, because previously there was an enhancement for people who engaged in sex work, a felony level enhancement. And so I think one of the things I'm most proud of about the Georgia Coalition is even without that representation, we did not want to leave the sex worker community behind. And they still did the work to make sure that that was removed from the law. And I think that that is really kudos to the intersectional nature of our work and just approaching it from a lens of like, we know that this is a broader issue outside of just our community at this table. And so I think what was great about the coalition is we still took that into consideration and made sure to incorporate it into our proposed language. And so I think that was huge because, you know, we have coalitions that actively have members that are in the sex worker community that still aren't supportive of sex workers and to reform these felony level enhancements. And here we had a group that lacked that representation, but was still, you know, not willing to leave our brothers and sisters behind. And I think that was huge for the Georgia coalition.
Exactly. So when we think of and I totally lost my train of thought. Give me a minute. So Jada, you were talking through exactly, and we were talking about, you know, making the decision, you know, and Jeff as well, about whether it was going to be a felony. And Jeff, you said we didn't want to score a political win. So just for the folks on the call, and I know you posted it in the chat, but can you go through what the changes are, what we did succeed? Because I want people to understand that we knew we were like, we checked this box, we checked this box, we checked this box, and then we got to the felony and we were like, yeah, we don't care what we checked, we're not gonna do this. So if you would just go through and say, what were all of those boxes that we checked?
Yeah, you know, I think it's important to note we did check a lot of boxes.
We checked a lot of boxes.
Like, yeah. we really did. And so let me just talk about before 2022, a
Mhm.
person living with HIV could be convicted of a felony. It could face up to 10 years imprisonment, excuse me, for failing to disclose their status before having sex with another person, offering or agreeing to have sex in exchange for money, soliciting another to perform or submit to an act of sodomy in exchange for money, sharing needles or syringes, or donating blood, bodily fluids, or organs. So 5 categories where a person living with HIV could face prosecution in Georgia. So I think it's important to know that there was no consideration regarding intent to transmit, no transmission required either. It applied to sexual intercourse. It could involve an anus, mouth, even though HIV is rarely, if ever, transmitted through oral sex. And the only affirmative defense was disclosure of your status prior to engaging in sex. We also had this enhancement for people living with HIV or hepatitis who could face a felony level enhancement for causing another to come into contact with their blood, semen, vaginal secretions, saliva, urine, feces, and that was in a correctional setting. So what we did as a coalition is that we required an intent requirement. That's huge. So people living with HIV now must know their status, fail to disclose their status, and intentionally seek to transmit HIV. And then engage in sexual behavior that is actually scientifically proven or poses a significant risk of transmission. So that is a huge victory for us. We also got rid of, in regards to sex workers, they have to intentionally seek to transmit and also engage in a sex act that poses, or agree to engage in a sex act that poses a significant risk of transmission. So we kind of tried to model it after what we did in regards to people living with HIV. We tried to model that sex worker enhancement, the language the same, to inquire intent when it wasn't before, and to take, of course, what we know scientifically about routes and risk of transmission into consideration. So that was a big part of it, is catching it up to what we know about routes and risk of transmission today regarding HIV, and to have it scientifically sound. So any risk of transmission must be based on current scientifically evidenced methods of transmission. Any provisions about sharing needles or syringes were completely repealed. People living with HIV couldn't be prosecuted for asking another to perform or submit an act of sodomy without disclosing their status, so we got rid of that. We also repealed the provision regarding donating blood products, or blood and bodily fluids or organs, without disclosing their status. And we also got rid and repealed the felony level punishment for people living with hepatitis or HIV in the correctional setting, where they exposed a correctional officer to, allegedly exposed through blood, semen, vaginal secretion, saliva. And with the felony, although felony level punishments were retained, we were able to reduce the punishment from 10 years to 5 years. So I know we kind of talked a little bit about, of course, we still want to do some work in Georgia. I think next for us is requiring actual transmission, I think would be a great way to kind of round out this bill. Of course, I would love to completely get rid of anything regarding sex workers. It's already a crime. There doesn't need to be anything specific to individuals that are living with HIV. So I think there are still a few tweaks that we can make, but overall, it is a really, really solid law that accomplishes a lot of the principles that we wanted to incorporate were incorporated into the law. I really strongly encourage everyone to look at that before and after, just to give you an idea of exactly all of the hard work that went into this bill and what it looks like when we got it across the finish line.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I remember the day after, the bill was actually signed, and was like, wow, we got a lot. And yes, that the darn felony was still sitting there. There's a big red blot, but it was a much smaller red blot than it could have been. So we were really grateful for that. Have one more question. It may be too early to tell, since it's only been a year, but do we know if arrests have fallen, if there have been any arrests in the last year?
I don't believe that we do know. I do think it's important because we haven't actually said this. Part of the education work that we did along the way was with prosecutors. And so we actually did get several of the prosecutors in the Metro Atlanta area, major areas, and not just Metro Atlanta, we also in Athens, DAs and prosecutors to voluntarily pledge that they understood that this was an unfair and unjust law and they would not enforce it. So I think that part of the data, correct me if I'm wrong, Jada, but that came out of the Williams Institute report, and they actually did, I think, a series of 3 reports for us over time. We did see a pretty dramatic drop off towards the end of this process anyway, in terms of prosecutions that we knew about. But yeah, it's been 1 year. I think it's probably going to be a couple of years before we're going to be able to go back and actually look at data on this. But just anecdotally, I've not heard of any, and something that had just been a problem that we had talked about in some audiences, I think, to get some of the support from Republicans that we did. One of the talking points we used with them is actually a couple of our infectious disease doctors here in the Metro Atlanta area routinely were getting called in to provide expert testimony. And it was oftentimes public defenders that are overworked and overpaid, and people that are doing really
underpaid.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, overworked and underpaid. Sorry. Yes, correction. Doing really good work without any sort of resources. But what oftentimes they would do when faced with one of these prosecutions is that they would put the entire concept of HIV on trial. Mm-hmm. And they would actually pull some of these horrible HIV denialist arguments around HIV testing. HIV just isn't even a thing that exists. And too often that would be where infectious disease experts would get pulled in to try to testify about this in court, and it would show up in newspapers. And that was another thing that we had as a goal to eliminate that, because not just the stigma and the unjustness of the law itself, but how sometimes without having any other form of defense attorneys would then act recklessly as well to give a lot of misinformation about HIV out into the community.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So as we get ready to close out, what is the advice to other states that are still in the process of trying to get their law changed, modernized, repealed, whatever? What would you say? What's the key learning here?
I think for me, it would be persistence pays off. You know, over 10 years for a law it can seem like a really long time. And when you feel like you get so close and then the bill dies, it really takes a lot to come back next legislative session. So I think that's an important lesson. And I also think really having members of the community be an integral part of the coalition. I think that is something that sets the Georgia group apart from other coalitions that I've worked with. And so I think being able to compromise was obviously huge for us as well. And I just want to round it out by saying I'm so proud of all that we were able to accomplish. I really do. I mean, it is a great bill, regardless of anything that we need to circle back for. Overall, it's still an amazing bill, and it is going to make a huge difference in the lives of people living with HIV. And I think we will see that in a few years. We might not have that data now, but I think in a few years, we will see that this law did have that effect.
Awesome. Jeff, before I go to you on the same question, I do have another question from the question box. With so many anti-trans bills in many states occurring, do you have any recommendations for trans folks who may engage in activism, who live with HIV, or who may be incarcerated for protesting?
I think